Hello, everybody. How you guys all doing today? Everybody good? Enjoying the Homestead Festival? Yeah, me too. Awesome. Well, my name is Robyn Jackson, and I'm the owner of a business called Cheese from Scratch, a business that teaches homesteaders around the world how to turn their milk into cheese. I'm here today all the way from British Columbia, Canada. I traveled down with my mom, Gloria, and my sister, Brett, who are sitting right here. My mom has actually never made cheese before, but she's going to be helping me out because we've got several pots of curds going here today. So she's going to be stirring, and hopefully we have these curds ready for when we need them. All right, so we can flip that. Oh, perfect. We're on there. All right, so back in Canada, my husband, Zach, and I have 3 young children, and we own and operate a 250-head beef cattle ranch. Anyone that was here yesterday saw that I did a Homestead Cheesemaking 101 presentation yesterday, where I kind of really set the foundations of how to get started making cheese. We looked at ingredients, and we looked at something called the master curd demo that I'll talk a little bit more about later on in this presentation. I talked about yesterday how my husband and I keep a few milk cows on our homestead with the primary purpose of turning that milk into all sorts of different dairy products as well as cheese for our family. A few years ago, I decided to turn my passion of cheesemaking into a business with the goal of not only teaching other homesteaders how to make cheese, but also teaching them how to fit cheesemaking into their life. Because as homesteaders, cheesemaking should not take over our life, but it should kind of fit into it. So I hope in today's presentation, as well as yesterday's presentation, I'm able to give you guys a few tips and tricks that are going to help you to be able to fit cheesemaking into your life a lot better. One of the tricks that I just want to mention now, because I think that I will forget about it, and I was talking with it about someone right before this presentation, is that one of the recommendations that I make for people who are just getting started cheesemaking is to just start with 1 or 2 cheeses that your family loves, and just start making those cheeses and make them over and over and over again. And that's going to be able to help you guys fit cheesemaking into your life a lot better, as well as be successful in your cheesemaking. All right, we can flip. Perfect. So in today's presentation, we're just going to do a brief summary of what I talked about yesterday. Look at the ingredients, look at the equipment you need for cheesemaking. All of that's going to be really brief. I'll talk about how to find a recipe, and then we're going to dive into some real demos of how to make a hard and soft cheese. I'm just making generalized cheeses today, not specific cheeses, and I list soft cheeses as, for example, brie or feta, any type of cheese that's going to be pressing itself with its own weight. And then we're going to make a hard cheese that actually needs some pressure put onto it, and some examples of that would be Gouda or Colby or cheddar, Parmesan, Asiago, those types of cheeses. So we're just going to be making generalized cheeses, and that way you guys can go home and you can kind of look at the recipes, and you'll probably know how to do most of the steps throughout those recipes. I'll also be ending with a little piece on how to set up an aging area for you guys. All right. So just a little overview of yesterday's presentation. So yesterday we looked at the origin of cheese, not in a historical perspective, but in a natural perspective. So milk actually wants to become cheese. In nature, young ruminants, whether that's calves or goat kids or lambs, they depend on cheese making for their survival. Little calves, they take the milk from their mother's udder. It's warm, and it goes into their stomach where it's also warm. It's acidic. There are enzymes there. We know this enzyme as rennet. And all of these things combine to cause that milk to go from its liquid form to its solid form, or its cheese form. Kind of understanding this natural process of cheese making really helps me to be able to troubleshoot in my cheese making and kind of bring that idea of it is a natural process. And if something goes wrong in your cheese making recipe, it's very unlikely that it's actually ruined. It's just different than you intended. We also looked at the ingredients used in cheese making. I'll do a little bit on that today. And we looked at something called the master curd demo, which I'll also just briefly go over. All right, so yesterday we talked about the ingredients and how to source them. Some takeaway points from yesterday's presentation was that if you're sourcing raw milk, you want to be sourcing good quality and fresh raw milk. So we talked about how my preference is if I'm making any aged cheese, I'm trying to use milk that is no older than 2 days, and that's going to give me the most success in my cheese making. Bacterial starter culture, I talked about how to source it online at any cheese supply store. You can buy what's called freeze-dried starter culture. There's 2 main head categories of that, mesophilic and thermophilic. And I recommend buying 1 mesophilic and 1 thermophilic, and that's going to cover you for a lot of different recipes. I also talked about how I keep my own cheese-making starter culture at home. It's called a clabber culture. It's basically the sourdough starter of cheese making. I feed it every day, just how you might feed a sourdough starter, and I use it as a cheese making starter culture in all of the different recipes that I make. So if you weren't here for yesterday's presentation, you can learn how to keep a clabber culture on my blog. I have a really extensive blog post on there that just teaches people how to do that, as well as a YouTube video that's linked through that blog post. Rennet, you can source it at any cheese supply website. I recommend sourcing animal rennet is probably the best one for cheese making. And then finally, salt, you can just source from your regular grocery store, and making sure that you're getting a salt that doesn't have any additives in it, no anti-clumping agents, is going to give your cheese the best success. So as far as equipment goes, you probably already have everything in your kitchen that you already need to get started cheese making. And what I like to kind of mention here is that cheese has been made for thousands of years, and it's been made in really primitive ways. It's been made, pressed under rocks. It's been made in baskets and in clay pots. So you can really make do with what you have in your kitchen, and then you can kind of expand as you learn more cheese making. As you make more cheese, you can add to your collection. One big one on here is cheese forms and presses that I often get a lot of questions about, and I'll kind of talk about those as we go throughout the presentation. All right, so to find a recipe, on my website, I have quite a few recipes at cheesefromscratch.com. You can go on there. In this digital age, we have no shortage of recipes. There's also cheesemaking.com is a really good resource. Gavin Weber on YouTube, Cheese52 on YouTube. They're all really great resources. My very favorite books for cheese making are David Asher, The Art of Natural Cheese Making. So if you're into natural cheese making, if you're into keeping a clabber culture, all of those things, that's a really great book. And he has another one coming out this summer, which I had the opportunity to read already, and it's amazing. So I really recommend his work, as well as Deborah Amaran Boyes. And so her book, 200 Easy Homemade Cheese Recipes, is actually the book that I learned how to make cheese on. It has a lot of really great recipes in it. And then I also have my own book coming out, set to release in spring 2025 with Homestead Living Publishing, who actually have a tent here this weekend. So the master curd recipe that we looked at yesterday basically takes liquid milk and it turns it into a curd mass. So all of the different recipes that I make start with these same 4 steps of warming your milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, adding in a culture, whether it's your clabber culture or your bacterial freeze-dried culture, adding in your rennet, and then finally covering your pot and letting it sit for about an hour, and then you're going to have a coagulated mass in your pot. And so that's where our presentation today is going to start. I've got a pot of curds going there, and I've got a coagulated mass in here, and that's going to be how I'm going to fit all of this into a very tiny portion of time. So if you guys need more guidance on this kind of master curd recipe, if you didn't get my presentation yesterday, there's quite a few resources out there online, or just come and ask me afterwards, and I can give you a little bit more guidance. Yeah, so these are the steps that we're going to be looking at today. As I said, I'm not making a specific cheese. I'm making kind of generalized cheeses. So these are kind of the steps that you're going to see in most cheese-making recipes in some form. So I'm going to kind of deep dive into them for both a soft cheese as well as a hard cheese. All right, the good stuff now. So we have added in our rennet, we have waited an hour, and now we're coming to our cheese pot. And we should have a nice coagulated mass in there. And I'm hoping that you guys can actually see this up on the thing there. So we've got a PowerPoint, just in case you can't actually see what I'm doing here. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check for something called a clean break. So what we're doing here is actually checking to make sure that our curd mass is firm enough and that it's ready to go on to the next stage of stirring. So when we check for a clean break, there's several ways of doing it, but my very favorite way of doing it, I wonder, are we able to put the camera on for there? Oh, sorry. Okay. Maybe you'll be able to see it. If not, it's just basically like that. So I'm just going to make a little slit in the milk with my knife like that, and then we're going to go underneath, and I'm going to pull up. And then, I don't know, I don't think you guys can see that, but it should be a nice clean break. There shouldn't be any little pieces falling off, any loose little bits. If there is, all you're going to do is you're going to cover that pot back up, you're going to walk away for 10 minutes and come back and check it again. This one is a nice clean break, so I'm ready to move on to my next step. Before I do, I just want to go through a couple troubleshooting things for you guys here in this step. And if you have never made cheese before, I apologize because this is all going to seem really overwhelming. Just kind of watch and don't even bother taking notes or anything like that. Later on, when you're going and you're actually hands-on making cheese, it's all going to make so much more sense. Hopefully, it will just kind of come back up. Oh, I think I saw Robyn doing something like that at the Homestead Festival. So yeah, just try not to get overwhelmed because I know if you never have made cheese, this might just seem like a lot. Okay, so troubleshooting here. So if you come back and your curd mass is sunk below a layer of whey, that means that your milk was quite acidic. So you're often going to see this if you're making a type of cheese called quick mozzarella. Has anybody ever made that cheese before, just with a citric acid? Nobody? Okay. So oftentimes that's a cheese that people sort of start with. I don't recommend it as a starter cheese, but oftentimes people do start with this type of cheese. So what you do with that cheese is you add a citric acid into the milk before you even warm the milk up, before you even add your rennet in, you add that citric acid in. So when you come back to that pot of milk, your whole curd mass is probably going to be sunk below a layer of whey. And that's just your sign that that milk was quite acidic. Where you run into problems with that is if you didn't add any sort of acid in and you're coming back and your milk is sunk below the whey, that's your sign that that milk was acidic and maybe something was kind of not good with it. So maybe you should troubleshoot back to the cow I talked about yesterday. If I'm ever troubleshooting milk, I always go back to the cow, do a CMT test, troubleshoot how you're storing that milk, make sure you're using that fresh milk. Those are all signs that you should be troubleshooting that. Another problem is if you come back and it's not quite ready. As I mentioned, you're just going to cover that pot up again, really prioritizing warmth with cheese making. Again, we're going back to that little calf stomach where we're thinking that that little calf stomach is nice and warm, so we're thinking about that throughout our entire cheese making process. Yeah, so you come back after 10 minutes and check it again, and it's probably ready by then. So if you come back and it's not coagulated at all, this is where I start troubleshooting my rennet. So the first thing that I would do is ask myself if I actually added the rennet, because that has happened to me more times than not, where I'm like, oh yeah. And then what you would do, you just add it in now. The second thing I do is, did I actually dilute the rennet? So I talked about yesterday how the most important thing when you add rennet into a pot is making sure that you're diluting it. So I would troubleshoot that. Rennet is actually heat sensitive. So if you forgot the burner on your pot and your milk got really hot, 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit is usually where rennet is deactivated. If you diluted it in really hot water, that will also deactivate it. So just kind of troubleshooting those things. If your pot cooled down, so rennet needs heat to work. If, again, back to that little calf stomach, if it has cooled down significantly, it's not going to work as quickly. It will coagulate eventually, but you would be wanting to prioritize warmth with that cheese pot. And then finally, the last troubleshooting thing on there is if you come back and you've got a swirly texture in your milk. So you guys can't see, but this is a nice, clean, gelatinous mass in this pot. If I came back and it was sort of swirly, that's just my sign that that milk was actually still moving when it started to coagulate. So yesterday I talked about the importance of kind of stopping the milk with your spoon after you add the rennet, or when you stir the rennet in, and that's just to prevent that swirly texture. Other than kind of a cosmetic thing, it's not a big deal at all. All right, we can switch to our next slide there. All right, so after you have checked for a clean break and you know that you have a curd that can withstand some manipulation, it's time to cut the curds. So different recipes will have you cut the curds into different sizes. Now, typically a drier type cheese, for example, a Parmesan, Asiago, any Alpine-style cheese, is going to have the curds cut into very tiny pieces. And this is often actually done with a whisk, where you would just be inserting the whisk into the pot all over, and it's a really fun way to cut the whole curd mass. You don't really even have to be that gentle. You can just kind of cut those curds up into those really tiny pieces. Now, any moister type cheeses, for example, Goudas, Cheddars, Colbys, Bries, Fettas, are going to have you actually cut the curds into what we call a curd grid. So different curd grids will be different sizes. It's usually about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. And basically, you're making these curds into little squares. So when you cut a curd grid, oops, sorry, hit that. What you're going to do is basically insert your knife all the way down to the pot, the bottom of the pot, and you're going to pull it across, and you're going to cut yourself a checkerboard. And so if it was a 1/2 inch, you would be going a 1/2 inch. If it's 1 inch, you'd be going 1 inch. And then you're going to go across like this, all the way down to the bottom. And then this is a really, really important step. And I'm one of those people that if I can skip a step, I will skip a step because I've got 3 kids at home. It's pretty busy. But I don't skip this step. So I always let my curds rest for 5 minutes right here. So I just cut a checkerboard in here. Right now, these curds are nice long pillars in my milk. I'm not going to come back and cut them down into little cubes until 5 minutes has passed. And what's happening during this time is the edges of these curds are starting to firm up, and that's going to keep me from making really mushy curds, which is going to affect the texture of my cheese. If I wanted to make a really dry cheese, I would just cut it with a whisk, because cutting curds with a whisk is the funnest way to do it anyways. So I have to wait this 5 minutes if I want to be able to retain that moisture in my curds. Now, I don't know if I have time to wait that 5 minutes today, so I might have to break my one rule unless I can talk about troubleshooting things here. I'll talk about a few and then I'll come back and cut underneath. So my curd mass, a problem that some people have is my curd mass is spinning around the pot. So they go to cut their curds, and their curd mass is just doing a little swirl in there. And so if that happens, that's just your sign that you probably had a clean break about 20 minutes ago, and you just came back a little bit late. It's not a big deal at all. Just cut the curds. Other than just being a little bit annoying to cut, it's not going to be a big problem. A problem that some people have is that my curds, actually that everybody has, I should say that, is that my curds are uneven after the entire cutting process. And this happens to everyone. It is impossible to get even curds in your cheese pot in the home setting, unless you have something called a designated curd cutter, which I actually have at home, and it's very nice and fancy, but it's not something that you actually need. So if your curds are uneven, don't worry, because we're going to fix that later on in the stirring stage. So I have to come back now, it's not been 5 minutes, and cut underneath my curds. So as I talked about, your curds are always going to be uneven. My favorite way to try and get as even as curds as I can is to cut with like a, I don't know what you guys call this, a spatula? Yeah, spatula. So you're just going to go under about, say I'm doing an inch right now, so you're going to go under about an inch, under about an inch, under about an inch, and then you're going to flip it around under about an inch, under about an inch, and again. And then you're going to wait another 5 minutes. And as I said, we probably don't have time for that, but we'll let it wait for a little bit. And that's going to keep us from making a really dry cheese. All right. So your recipe is going to tell you, so the next stage is stirring stage. And your recipe is going to tell you how long as well as how much you should heat your curds. Some curds some recipes don't heat the curds at all. They just have you stirring. For example, my mom is just stirring curds that have not been heated at all right now. But some recipes will say, oh, heat the curds up to 105 degrees over, say, 40 minutes. And what this means is that you should be constantly stirring those curds, and you should be gradually heating it up so that you're getting to that 105 degrees at about the end of that 40 minutes. So it is really time-consuming for some types of cheeses, but sometimes cheeses are only stirred, for example, like the soft cheese is only going to be stirred for about 10 minutes. So you can kind of pick a cheese that works good for your lifestyle. But because cheeses are all made with those same 4 ingredients, if a recipe calls for you to do something, you really kind of have to do it to achieve that desired result. So even though it's not going to be ruined if you don't do it that way, if you really want that really nice cheddar that actually tastes like a cheddar, or that nice Colby that actually has that elastic paste like a Colby, you do want to be following the recipe. And part of that is stirring. So I talked about how don't worry about your curds being uneven sizes, because we're going to fix that later on in the stirring stage. So no matter what type of cheese I'm making, no matter what the recipe says, I always make the first 5 minutes of my stirring kind of an extension of that cutting phase. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to be pulling the curds. I'm going to use my spatula here. I'm going to be pulling the curds up from the bottom of the pot, the ones that I know that aren't the right size, and I'm just going to be kind of, I don't know if you guys can see that. Probably not. That's okay. I'm just going to be kind of lifting them up. So pretend that was a really giant curd, and I'm just going to be cutting it with my spoon. And so you're just going to do that for 5 minutes. I'm not going to turn the burner on. I'm just going to gently just be pulling those really big curds up. And yeah, see, there's like a whole pillar there that you couldn't get that with your spoon. So you're just going to go and just kind of cut them down to size. Actually, Brett, do you want to come up here and do that for me? While I chat. And so in this first 5 minutes, you do really have to be quite gentle with these curds because it is pretty easy to break them up. Like I can tell right now that I didn't let these curds sit for long enough because they are kind of shattering. They're becoming too small than I would like. But I just didn't have the time. I was impatient. You have to be patient with cheese making. All right, so I'm going to let Brett just gently bring the curds up and then just kind of cut them down to size. Thank you, guys. Brett's never made cheese either. Well, I continue to talk here. All right. So after that 5 minutes of stirring and bringing the curds up, you can either start to stir with your really clean hand, and especially during garden season on the homestead, you want to be scrubbing under those nails, or you can just continue to stir with a spoon. If your recipe calls for heating, you can begin to heat it. Now, if your recipe doesn't call for heating, I almost always bring the temperature of that pot back up to the initial temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever your recipe had you doing, just because we are, again, prioritizing that warmth of the little calf stomach. That's going to help you to make better cheese. It's going to help with drainage. It's going to help with fermentation. All of those things are going to be aided by you maintaining warmth within that pot. What else do I want to talk to you about this? All right, so different styles of cheeses are going to have you looking for different firmnesses in the curds. I'm hoping that my mom's are going to be ready here pretty soon, but Brett's are probably almost ready. So I'm going to first show you guys how to check if your soft curds are ready. And I always say go by your recipe directions, but this is just a generalized soft cheese, generalized hard cheese. So for the soft cheese, you want to go by your recipe directions, but I'm going to show you kind of how I know that they're ready to go on to being put into their forms. I wonder if you guys can see. Maybe I'll put this here. So we can probably push this up a little bit. Brett, you can keep stirring it. All right, so when I'm testing if a soft curds, and this is generalized rule, is this is a cheese that's going to be pressed with its own weight. It's going to go into a form. There's not going to be any pressure on it. What I'm looking for is that when I scoop my hand into this cheese pot and I hold those curds in my hand for a few seconds, what I want to see, I didn't hold it long enough, is that these curds have started to knit themselves together. I don't know if you can see that. So if you hold it there for a second, these curds have started to knit themselves together, and that's your sign that they can go on to the next step. Another good test to see if these curds are ready is to take one of that is sort of like the regular size of the rest of your pot and hold it about 30 centimeters. What is 30 centimeters in inches? I don't know. 10? You're going to hold it about 10 inches above the table. Then you're going to drop it. If it bounces, it's ready. If it splats, it doesn't. It's not quite ready. You want to stir a little bit longer. So we're looking for a tiny bounce. There was a tiny bounce there. It's going to splat eventually, but a tiny bounce, that's also a sign that it's still able to, I would probably stir these curds for a few more minutes, but we don't actually have time. It's probably good to go on to the next step of packing it into your cheese form. So I'm just going to do the whole process of packing these into the cheese forms with the soft one, and then we'll kind of bounce around a bit and then go back to the hard cheese. So the next step after you know your curds are ready is to pack them into your cheese forms. And this is what the forms are going to be what is going to be the final shape of your cheese. So there's all sorts of different soft cheese forms that you can buy or you can make kind of DIY at home. I have like this nice fancy clay one that I had a friend make out of pottery, but most of the time you're going to buy them on a cheese supply store. They're going to be kind of like a basket. The biggest thing when choosing a cheese form for a soft cheese that's pressing itself with its own weight is to make sure you choose a tall enough form. So these cheeses are going to reduce down a lot. They're probably going to reduce down, depending on how long you stir it, about 3/4. So this cheese is going to make cheese that's only like about that thick, really. So you want to make sure that you're choosing a tall enough form so you're not making a pancake-style cheese. This one, this one's probably fine. So when you put the curds into the form, because they are really soft and there's not a lot of whey here, I don't even bother kind of getting all the whey out of this cheese pot. I'm just going to actually scoop the whole thing into the cheese pot, and then I'm just going to use my hands and I'm going to pile it on high. And you're going to notice while we're standing here, this is going to reduce down really a lot. And the cool thing about soft cheeses is that because they reduce down so quickly, is that if you don't have enough cheese forms, or you don't have enough curds in the pot to fill another cheese form, is you can actually just put a lid on the pot, maintain the warmth of those curds, and you can come back in like 10 minutes and I can pack more curds on there. And you can do that for an hour. You can just keep packing more curds on, especially if you're worried because your cheese form is flat or something, or is a little bit too short. So that's one little hack there for you. So all you're going to do with these cheeses that are in these soft forms is you're going to let them drain. After about an hour, usually you can come back and you can flip the cheeses in the forms. We might be able to, at the end of this presentation, I might be able to flip this one. Larger cheeses, so if I was making a soft style cheese, sometimes I make like giant bries or giant, I don't know, like a camembert in these big style ones. Oftentimes it takes like 2 hours before they're firm enough that you can actually flip them. So when choosing a cheese form for these soft cheeses, some good examples of just like homemade things you can use are like yogurt containers with holes poked in them, salad spinner strainers. You can kind of just get creative with what you have. And as long as you don't really care what the shape of your cheese ends up as, you could really get creative. So that is soft cheeses. And I think I'm going to test if my mom's curds are ready, and then we'll go on to packing hard cheeses in. Thank you, guys. All right. So I think we're probably good. You guys could, yeah, thank you. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the presentation, but you do want to be being pretty clean with your cheese making equipment. I wouldn't say that I sterilize everything every day, but I'm pretty clean. So we're definitely not going to be eating these cheeses today. It's not clean enough. And that's just to give your bacteria the best chance at being able to thrive, the bacteria that you have added into this cheese. All right, so we're going to test if these firm curds are going to be ready for pressing. So anytime that you are going to be applying any pressure onto your cheese, you want to make sure that they are at least meeting this requirement. And your recipe might have you stirring them a little bit further and stuff, but if they don't meet this requirement, they can't have pressure applied to them. And so what this requirement is when you squeeze them in your hand, these ones aren't quite ready actually. When you squeeze them in your hand, you want them to be, I wonder if you guys can see them. You want them to be clinging together, and then when you rub your thumb over it, you want them to be falling off into individual pieces. And this is your sign that these curds can withstand some pressure. So when you squeeze, that is the makeshift pressure for the moment. And when you rub them between your hands, they should be falling off into individual curds. Now the curds should also have some firmness to them. So when you push them between your finger, they shouldn't shatter. So these ones actually aren't ready, but we're going to have to use them anyways. What they should do is they should have more of a gum-like feel. So when you push them between your fingers, they should just kind of press down like gum. So if I was at home right now, I wouldn't be going on to the next step with these curds, but because of time constraints, we kind of have to. So that is a really important test for you guys to do if you are making any sort of cheeses that need to be pressed, it's called the squeeze test. To do that squeeze test to make sure that they can withstand that pressure. If you don't do that, what's going to happen is you're actually going to crush the curds when you go and apply that pressure, and that's going to give you a really weird textured cheese. That's going to give you something called mechanical holes in your cheeses. So if you make cheese and you're having a lot of mechanical holes in your cheeses, it actually, the source of the problem is probably in the cheese pot. Your curds are probably not ready to press when you go on to press them. So just as a little example of that, so what a mechanical hole is it's basically a fossil in the cheese of a curd that had too much moisture. And so if there's some really big curds in here, if you didn't get your curds down to a really even size, for example, I don't know if you guys can see that all these curds are pretty little, but there's this big one. This one would most definitely leave a mechanical hole in my cheese. So when you apply pressure to that cheese, all the other curds, they can withstand the pressure, but this one just crushes. And that's going to leave a fossil of moisture in your cheese. The cheese will eventually evaporate or absorb the moisture, but it's going to leave that little hole. So that's why I tell people if they're having a lot of mechanical holes, it starts in the cheese pot. It starts from your curds not actually being able to ready to withstand that pressure. All right, so we're going to pretend that these curds just passed that squeeze test, and we're going to go on to draining the whey from these curds. So I guess you guys can't see, but versus this, I don't know if I do it. So versus this pot, there's not a lot of whey on the top of it. Whereas this pot that has been stirred a long time, there's quite a bit of whey on there. So I can actually remove that whey before I go on to taking those curds out of the pot. Now, depending on how long you stirred it, sometimes you can just take the whole pot and you can dump it into the bucket, and those curds will actually stay on the bottom. These ones won't because they're still too moist. But if you're doing like a really long stir, like an hour or something, usually you can just do that, and that's going to save you from having to do what I'm going to show you how to do here. So when you drain the whey from the cheese pot, the best way to do it is to just take a colander or your cheese form or whatever you want and pop it into the pot, and you're just going to dip whey directly. Can you guys see that? You're just going to dip whey directly out of that cheese pot, or out of that cheese form. And you're going to go down right until you see the surface of the curds and you've gotten most of the whey out. Now, if you wanted, you could drain your whole curds through a colander, but oftentimes at home I'm making like a 6-gallon batch of cheese, so I just physically can't lift the cheese pot. And so this method works really well for me. Sometimes I can lift the cheese pot if it's the end of summer and I've been working all summer. All right. So you're just going to go until you see the surface of the curds. I wish you guys could see this, but we're almost down to the surface of the curds here, getting as much whey out as I can. And when you actually get to where you can no longer scoop directly out of the cheese form, you can usually scoop off the surface of the whey, or off the surface of the curds. So I'll show you that in a second. I can still get more out here. So you want to get as much whey out of the pot as you can. And I don't know if anybody saw Kate's presentation right before mine, Udder to Butter, but I can't remember how she put it, but there's more than one way to do things, basically, was the phrase that she was going for. And so there is more than one way to do things to get this moisture out of the pot. So just kind of using common sense. All the time in cheese making, you can just use common sense, which is kind of hard when you're learning a new skill. But the more and more you practice making cheese, the more and more you're going to realize, oh, this is just kind of common sense. All right, so I can no longer scoop whey out of this, but the curds have all kind of congealed onto the bottom. I don't know if you can see that. They've all sort of congealed onto the bottom of the pot. So now I can just scoop directly off the curds I grabbed a couple there, but without grabbing too many curds. And you're really going to try and get most of that whey off of those curds. All right, so once you get most of the whey off the curds, you're going to get again, prioritizing warmth, you're going to put the lid on your pot so these curds don't get cool, because warmth is everything, again, in cheese making. And you're going to get your cheese press and your cheese form all ready to go. So when you're choosing a cheese form for hard-pressed cheeses, the biggest thing is to make sure, again, that you're using a tall enough form that's not going to give you a pancake cheese, because when you're aging a really flat cheese, it gives you a really dry cheese, and it doesn't have that nice textures that you're looking for. I recommend that you actually don't DIY cheese forms unless you're using like a bucket or something. But when you buy cheese forms online, they're pretty inexpensive. Make sure that you buy a cheese form that is rated for about the amount of cheese you're going to make. So as a general rule, 1 pound of cheese comes from 1 gallon of milk. And this is a very, very general rule because different cows are going to have different amounts of yield in their milk. So when you go onto the cheese supply store, you can actually see that most of the cheese forms are rated for how much cheese they'll hold. So if you're planning on making, say, a 4-gallon batch of cheese most of the time, you're probably going to pick a 3 to 4 pound mold. If you're planning on making a 2-gallon batch, you're going to pick a 2-pound mold. So that's kind of a general rule for knowing how big of a mold you should be picking. The other thing that I recommend is that you buy a mold that has a follower. So a follower is just something that's going to sit in there, and most of the cheese presses, or even the DIY ones that I'm going to talk about later, need something to go on top of that curd and press it down. And I can't tell you how many times I have searched my house for something that will fit on top of my cheeses. So it's just way easier if you just buy a form that has a thing that will follower that will fit inside it. All right, so we're making a tiny little cheese today. So when you prepare your cheese form to accept your cheese, what you're going to do is you're going to have to line this with a cheesecloth. So this cheese, the soft little cheese, didn't need a cheesecloth in there because there's no weight on top of it. If I put a cheese in here without putting a cheesecloth in there, it would be kind of like one of those Play-Doh toys where all the hair comes out the bottom. So you have to always line your pressed cheeses with a cheesecloth. So one big important rule, usually I try to do this in a bucket that doesn't have curds in it. One big important rule when you line a cheese form with a cheesecloth is to make sure that it's wet. And this is going to, one, warm your form, and two, it's going to keep your cheese from sticking to that cheesecloth, because that's a common problem that happens to people, is their cheesecloths stick to their cheese, and then they pull the cheese apart, and it's not fun. So what you're going to do is you're going to just place that cheesecloth into the cheese form. This is just flour sack towels from Target here. That's my favorite type of cheesecloth. You can buy cheesecloth at online stores and stuff like that, but I like the flour sack towels because they're cheap and they work really well, and if you accidentally ruin one, it's got cheese stuck to it, it's not going to break the bank. They come in packs of 5. All right, so you've drained all the way from here, you've prepared your cheese form, and now what you're going to do is you're going to start to pack this cheese into the cheese form. So these curds are definitely not ready to withstand pressure. They're too loose, I can tell. But what we're going to do is we're just going to pack them in there. You can be quite firm when they're actually ready. If I pack them in right now, I'd probably crush them. So you can actually push down and get them pretty firm in there, pack them in. And all I'm doing is just pulling big chunks of these curds out of here. This is actually a perfect size cheese form for this. All right. So now this is a very, very important step. Again, one of those I don't skip steps, is that I always allow these curds to drain for 10 minutes after I pack them into the form. And so all you're going to do is you're going to go around the edges of your cheese form, and you're going to pull up on all the edges, and this is going to create nice smooth edges on your cheese, a nice smooth rind. You're going to pull up all the way around, and you're going to take one corner of the cheesecloth, and you're going to lay it flat over top of the cheese. And so I always wait 10 minutes now for this these curds to drain. And this is a really important, again, point in not getting mechanical holes in your cheese if you wait 10 minutes once you put it in the form. Because I don't know if this one really is because I was talking too long, but usually the whey is kind of running out of these curds, out of these holes of this form at this point. And if we added any pressure on top of that when that whey is running, what it would actually do is it would start to close the doors for that whey to be able to escape, and that whey would be trapped within the cheese. And that's going to give you weird tastes in your cheese. It's going to make it so that you have a lot of mechanical holes. So this waiting 10 minutes for these curds to drain before you apply that pressure is a really important step in all pressed cheese recipes. Doesn't matter if the cheese recipe asks for it, I always do it. Let's see where we're at here. I got to stirring, I got behind on my slides. All right. Perfect. We're on step 9. Is that what we got up there? Yeah, perfect. So after 10 minutes, usually you've noticed that the whey isn't dripping as much from the curds, and so that's your sign that it's ready to have some pressure applied to it. So rule of thumb when pressing cheese is always go lighter to heavier. Light pressure, just as a generalized rule, because there is this very fancy math equation that you can do that I still don't really understand. I tried to put it in my book, but I couldn't because I was like, I'm not the person to teach math. But anyways, as a general rule, light pressure is about 10 to 15 pounds. And you can calculate the radius and really get an accurate pressure on that. But what I find is if you are just stacking things on top of there, 10 to 15 pounds is probably going to be a good enough light pressure for you. When you're assessing to see if it's too heavy of a pressure, my general rule is that you never want the whey to be running from the cheese form. So if I applied pressure on here, I'm just going to use my hand. If I applied pressure on there, and you can see, I don't know if you can see that, the whey is running from the cheese press, that's way too hard. You want it to drip out. You want all of the whey to be able to escape out the doors. You don't want to be closing the doors and locking that whey in. So if you notice that the whey is running, that's when you just back off the pressure a little bit. After half an hour of pressing at light pressure, you're going to come back and you're going to take your cheese out, and I might be able to do it already. especially after that little pressing incident there. You're going to come back and you're going to do something called redressing your cheese. And when you redress a cheese, all you're going to do, I'm going to have a way mess here. When you redress a cheese, all you're going to do is you're going to take it out of the cheesecloth. And this will be half an hour from now, so it probably will look like a cheese. When I come back after a half an hour, usually all the curds are kind of knit together. They should be knit together. If they're not, that's your sign you really need to up the pressure a bit. And then you're going to flip it over, and then you're going to redress it like that. And it can go back in the cheese form. And again, you want to be going around the cheese and just pulling up all the edges, and that's going to give you a nice smooth rind. And you can redress as many times as you want. Usually I redress twice. So usually I'll redress after half an hour and redress after an hour just to make sure that I'm applying enough pressure. So, and then you're just going to put the top over there. And then now after that, I got a hair on there. After that, you are going to up the pressure to probably medium pressure. And what I say medium pressure is it's usually about probably 15 to 20 pounds is medium pressure. The only cheeses that you're going to be making at home that probably need high pressure would be cheddar. Cheddar needs all the pressure you can give it because it's a really hard cheese to press. Traditional cheddar, not really farmhouse cheddar. So that's, the cool thing about cheddar is it goes through this extra cheddaring process where it doesn't actually matter. It's really hard to lock moisture into it. So you really can give it all the pressure that you need. Other things that are really important for pressing is warmth. So one of the cool things about making DIY presses, we all have different pressing setups at home. That's why it's really hard to teach. But one of the cool things about DIY presses is you're often using a bucket as a follower. And so if you add warm whey into that bucket or warm water into that bucket, you're going to need to use significantly less weight to be able to press that cheese because, again, warmth is everything. In cheese making, the warmer those curds stay, the more they're going to drain, the better your fermentation is going to be. So that's going to significantly reduce the amount of pressure you need to add. Just some quick, what time is it, Mom? How much time do I got? Or does anybody have the time? 2:11? Okay, perfect, we got time. All right, so because we all have different pressing setups, I just want to talk about a couple really easy DIY ones that you can do. So buckets are great cheese presses. So you can have 2 buckets of the same size. If you have a cheese form like this, you can put it inside one of the buckets. Just put something that's going to, like a can or something on top of that, and then put another bucket on top and fill that bucket with water. That's a really great way to press cheese. That's going to keep you from having things topple over. I know I have my DIY one up there. So it's just a springform pan was what I was using for the cheese form piece. And then I've got the pan follower in there. I'm just using like a dishcloth for my cheese cloth in there. So like honestly, you can really make cheese in a really primitive setups. And then I have a bucket filled with warm water on there, and then some stacks of books. The only problem with setups like that is that they often topple over. One way you can prevent that is to wedge it under like a counter or something like that, and then that will keep it from knocking over. I've seen really creative ones where people use like ratchet straps, and they just press down on there. So you can get quite creative with how you're pressing your cheeses. Once you advance into like making quite a bit of cheeses and you want to invest in an actual press because there are merits to getting an actual press, my favorite style of press is called a Dutch press. And these types of presses use leverage. They're really easy to pull the cheese out and redress, and they just are really great presses. You can also get presses that use like a crank system. I don't like those ones as much. They're kind of hard to regulate pressure. And they're a real pain when you have to pull that cheese out. You have to unwind the wing nuts and pull the whole press apart, basically, to get that cheese out just to redress it. If you are looking into getting a press, I have a whole YouTube video on my YouTube channel about where I kind of review all sorts of different presses because I have tried a lot of them. And I also have had a like DIY setup one on there. I think that's all I had to say about pressing. No, I think that's everything I wanted to say about pressing. I'll take questions at the end, too, and then if you guys have any questions at all, especially if we've got some time. All right, so after, usually it's about 12 hours, you're going to add salt into your cheese. Did we got salt up there? Perfect. So your recipe is going to tell you when to salt your cheese. And it's really important that you follow your recipe directions for when you're going to be adding that salt to your cheese, just because that salt is coming in and it's starting to regulate the fermentation of your cheese. If you add it in too soon, you're going to be starting to regulate. Yesterday we talked about lactic bacteria and their importance in that first stage of fermentation. So if you add it in too soon, you're going to be starting to regulate those lactic bacteria too soon. There's certain types of cheeses that add the salt into the curds before you even put them into the press. Examples of that are cheddar. And the reason for that is those cheddars are actually coming out of the cheese pot at a lot lower of an acidity, meaning that those lactic bacteria have fermented a lot further already. And so when you add the salt in, it's needed. Those bacteria are ready to have that salt added in. So that's why not all cheeses have that salt added in before you go on to the pressing or the draining stage. Most cheeses, however, you're adding that salt in after they have a chance to press or drain into their final form. So usually this is about 12 hours after you make them. When you add salt, you kind of have two options, and your recipe will give you either a brining option or a dry salting option, but both of those options are actually interchangeable. They both do the exact same thing, so you can kind of choose which one you like best for your lifestyle. So if you're going to be brining your cheese, most often it's in something called a saturated brine or a 20% brine or 18% brine, they sometimes call it. But basically, it's 1 part salt to 5 parts water. So you're going to make a very salty brine, and you're going to brine that cheese in that brine. And depending on the denseness of your cheese, you're going to leave it in there for a certain amount of time. So really dry, firm type cheeses like Asiagos and Parmesans are often left in that brine for 4 hours per pound. Whereas soft cheeses, for example, a brie, would be left in there for like 1 to 2 hours per pound. And these cheeses are actually getting the exact same amount of salt. It's just because one is so dense and one is so soft, that salt is entering into them at different rates. Now, another option for salting your cheese would be surface salting or dry salting. And this is where you physically rub salt onto your cheese. So as I said, this is interchangeable. You can do this if you'd like. The general rule is 1 tablespoon of salt for every pound of cheese when you do this. And again, you can do this 1 tablespoon for every pound of cheese for all different types of cheeses, because all those cheeses are really taking about that same amount of salt. Yeah, I think that is all I wanted to say on that. Once you get a little bit fancier, and if you follow me on Instagram, you've probably seen me playing around with this a little bit. The very perfect time to salt cheese is actually when it's at a pH of 5.2. And there's a really neat trick to test if your cheese is at a pH of 5.2 is to see if it will stretch in a cup of really hot water. So as you advance in your cheese making a little bit, you might want to start playing around with this, because this is going to give you more consistent cheeses when you are salting them at that correct pH. I don't test pH in my cheese making other than just using that stretch test by stretching the cheese in the hot water. But it's just kind of something fun to do. And also, if you are looking to do a naturally acidified mozzarella, playing around with this also helps you to be prepared to make that type of cheese. All right, so step 11, drying your cheeses. So you can either dry your cheese at room temperature or at cave temperatures, and it really depends on where you live. In Tennessee, I would say definitely be drying your cheeses in cave temperatures because it's just so hot. In the summer at home in Canada, I always dry my cheese at cave temperatures. And so when you dry cheese, what you're really doing, I wonder if this one's firm enough for me to show you guys. If you're drying cheese at room temperature, all you have to do, I think it will maybe hold its shape for a few seconds, long enough for me to show you guys. All you're going to do if you're drying it at room temperature is just put it on a rack. Those picnic covers that keep bugs off food, those are really great for this because bugs will get in, flies will lay eggs in your food, and it's disgusting. So you want to be fly conscious when you're a cheesemaker. So get one of those big ones that will cover the entire thing, not just the cheese, the entire thing. That's a really great way to keep flies off cheese. Now, if you are drying your cheese in cave temperatures, and what I mean by that is between 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to talk about aging cheese in the next slide. But if you're drying your cheese at cave temperatures, you want to actually be putting it in a Tupperware box. And the reason for that, oops, I just spilt way on the stage. is you want to be maintaining the humidity of that cheese, because usually we're drying them in refrigerators is where we can get that temperature, and it's quite dry in refrigerators. So you're going to end up drying out the outside rind of your cheese before the inside has a chance to dry, and this is going to give you weird tastes in your cheese. So to dry your cheeses in the refrigerator, all you're going to do is put some sort of mat or rack, something in there to keep that cheese off of the surface of the bottom of the thing, and then you're going to put the whole cheese into there, and you're just going to put the lid on, kind of a jar. You don't want to be putting it right on. And then you can put this whole thing in your cheese aging fridge or cheese aging area, and then that's going to help you to have it continue to dry but not lose humidity and get too dry on the outside. So it's important to dry your cheeses to prepare them for aging. And we can go to the next slide, I think. I'm going to put this back in here. It's going to really pancake down. And this is just actually a little side note trick. If you accidentally make a cheese that is too tall, if you're making a soft type cheese like this, and you're like, oh darn, I chose a form that's way too tall for the type of cheese I'm making, just pull it out a little bit earlier, and it will kind of pancake itself down a bit. So that's a trick to fix that if you accidentally do that. All right. Oh, and here, actually, while we're at this, I'm going to show you how to flip a cheese that has been in that form. So all you're going to do, it's in there. You're just going to put your hand out like that, put it into your other hand, and pop it like that. There you go. All right. So aging. There's often lots of questions about aging. I have aged my cheeses in many different ways. The easiest way on the homestead is to vacuum seal your cheeses. And so any cheese that has been pressed can be vacuum sealed. As long as it doesn't need any mold ripening or anything, you can vacuum seal it. Vacuum sealing and waxing are interchangeable, and I prefer vacuum sealing just because it's a lot easier. Waxing, you have to get the kids out of the kitchen because it's hot, and you have to have designated waxing equipment. So it's just not really easy to fit into your life to wax cheeses, whereas vacuum sealing, as soon as your cheese is dry, you can take it and you can vacuum seal it, and you just put it in your cheese aging area. Natural rind cheeses is when you allow your cheeses to create their own rind. And this makes the best cheeses, but it's also quite complex. So when you're first learning how to make cheese and you're just trying to make cheeses that sort of just taste like the store, because I know a lot of us, that's our goal, We'd like to maybe make some fancy cheeses later on, but really the goal is to just use our milk from our cow and be able to feed our family a lot of cheeses. And so vacuum sealing helps you to be able to do that. Natural rind aging does take some practice. It takes some techniques. You're going to have to embrace the growth of mold, which is hard for a lot of us, but it's necessary when making aged cheese. So I'm not going to talk a bunch about naturally aging, but is something very fun once you have kind of dipped your toe into cheese making a little bit. So setting up an aging area to store your cheeses in. As I said, it needs to be between a temperature of 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The easiest way to do this is to actually just buy a fridge off of like Buy and Sell or Marketplace, Craigslist, or whatever. Buy an old fridge, and then you can get something online called an Inkbird, which is a thermostat regulator, and it plugs into the wall, and then you plug your fridge into it. And you set it to, I usually set mine to 50 degrees Fahrenheit because that gives me some grace if I'm opening the door a lot. Set it to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And then what it does is if the fridge gets too warm, it turns the fridge on. If the fridge gets too cold, it turns the fridge off. So you can't use the freezer with this method, but it does create a temperature-controlled environment for you. So if you are waxing or vacuum sealing your cheeses, you don't have to worry about monitoring humidity in your aging area. But if you're naturally aging your cheeses, you do have to monitor humidity. And usually you're trying to keep it at about 85% is what naturally aged cheeses are usually for humidity. So all my vacuum sealed cheeses, I'm just throwing into that fridge. They just hang out in there. I flip them maybe once a week just to promote a bit more even aging. And I don't have to look at them again until we go to eat them, really. Naturally aging cheeses, I have quite a few actually in my fridge at home right now, and I do have to baby them. I have to look at them at least every day for the first week or so, and then every couple days until they're done, really. And so I set up little humidity chambers in my aging area using Tupperware bins like this at home. And this allows me to be able to really baby each cheese, because different naturally aged cheeses are going to have different humidity requirements. They're going to have different requirements for you taking care of them, like brushing them or flipping them or patting them. There's all sorts of different things you have to do with naturally aged cheeses. But so I set all my naturally aged cheeses on a little mat in these Tupperware containers. This just raises them up off the surface, just like my little drying boxes. And then I'm going to set the cheese in there, and then I can put the lid ajar. I can adjust the humidity by simply just moving the lid more on or off. If the humidity is too high, I'm just going to be pulling the lid off a little bit. If it's too low, I'm going to be putting it on a little bit further. If it's still too low, I'm going to be taking a piece of paper towel, wetting it, crumpling it up, and putting it in there. And that's going to create a little humidity environment for those cheeses. And that's how you are able to make all sorts of different cheeses in these homemade aging setups. And also for monitoring humidity, you can get something called a hydrometer. Hydrometer? I can't say it. Hydrometer, yeah. Hydrometer, okay, there we go. You can get hydrometers. They sell them on Amazon. They're like $3 a piece. And for years, I was like, I'm not going to buy any fancy like cheese making equipment. I'm just going to use what I have. But now I bought like a whole package of them for like $12, and I'm like, why did I not do this sooner? So if you are making a lot of naturally aged cheeses, you probably want to buy a couple of those, and they can just sit in each box of yours, and it will help you have a little bit more accuracy in your cheese making. One thing I forgot to say when I was talking about the drying cheeses is something called the paper towel test that I do to make sure that the cheeses are ready to go on to aging. And so I just take a piece of paper towel and I stick it onto the cheese. And if you don't have paper towel, you can use a cloth or whatever. And if it comes away dry, that means that your cheese is dry enough to go on to aging. All right, so we can flip to the next slide. So making the most of my time at the cheese pot. So you guys saw me make, or me and my mom and my sister make several pots of curds today. Really, the only difference between those curds is how long we stirred them. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about different cultures and stuff you can be adding into your curds. But as you start to make more and more cheese, you're going to start to see a lot of similarities between different cheeses. And you're going to start to kind of make connections in your brain, like, oh, this curd right now feels like kind of like what I would have for cottage cheese. So maybe I'm going to take a few of these curds out and I'm going to use them for cottage cheese. I'm going to mix them with heavy cream. And now I have my cottage cheese for the week, but I also just made a pot of Gouda. So I'm able to make a lot of different dairy products for my family on the homestead by just kind of monopolizing on what I've got in the cheese pot and kind of making the most of it. And as I said, the more you make cheese, the more you make dairy products, the more you're going to kind of start to draw these conclusions yourself. All right, so just the last little note here. I know we covered a lot of information today, but the best thing you can really do for your cheese making is just get started. As I said, pick a couple cheeses that your family loves, start by making those, and just make them over and over and over again. Traditionally on the homesteads, people weren't making 200 different types of cheeses. You know, Ma Ingalls in Little House in the Big Woods, I know I talked about that book yesterday, but she was just making cheese for her family. That's all they say in the book, you know, just cheese. And she was probably making the exact same cheese, and she made it over and over and over again for her family. And that was the one that fit into her lifestyle on the homestead. And really, if you think about it, when we go to the grocery store, usually, unless it's like Christmas time or something, we're not going to buy a bunch of different cheeses. We're just going to buy the staple cheeses that our family likes. And so this is what I really recommend to people that do have dairy animals and are trying to get into cheese making. It's just going to make it way less overwhelming for you guys. All right, we can flip to the last slide there. Thank you guys so much for listening to this presentation. It's been such an honor to be here this weekend, just like talking amongst all of these amazing speakers. I got to watch a few this morning. Yeah, such an honor. I'm so happy to have been here. If you guys would like to learn from me, again, I am on Instagram quite frequently. You can find me at Cheese From Scratch, all those little underscores under there. You can also find recipes and all sorts of different things on my website, cheesefromscratch.com. I have a course. I have a monthly membership called the Milkmaid Society, where I create content, but I also hire other milkmaids from around North America to create content on all things cheese making, dairy processing, dairy goats, and milk cows. And I also have a book coming out, as I mentioned, in spring 2025 with Homestead Living. I'll be over here just if you guys have any questions at all. Thank you.